We have a good one for you today. We have Patty here with us. She is a grief coach, and we're going to talk about grief. That's something a lot of you have asked about and wanted Marie and I to talk about a little bit. So
Right.
we wanted to bring on a professional so that we can actually have some good insight for you guys. I guess the very first thing we want to kind of talk about is how did you get into grief coaching, and then we'll kind of go from there.
My career started. Let me just talk a little bit about my personal life, a little bit, how that's kind of is, because that kind of leads into my career. So my background really comes from addiction. I grew up in an alcoholic home with two parents who were addicts most of my life. My parents got recovered when I was 12. So at that point, my family moved into recovery. So, but when we talk about recovery, that means just stripping away the substance. The work starts right at that point. And we had many years of therapy and done a lot of work in counseling and coaching and all of that kind of stuff. And my mom started a treatment center that she had for 30 years. So there was a lot of family therapy, a lot of work that went into that. So kind of for me, that's where my career went into, into addictions work and counseling. So after I went into college, that's exactly what I did. Went into mental health and addictions for almost 17 years, right out of college. In saying that, I still had a lot of personal work that I needed to do in codependency, and a lot of my stuff still was coming up in my own life at that point. I married someone who played a codependent role in we had a codependent relationship, and I had my children very young.
Do you analyze a lot of things that you do just because you do have that background and you kind of know like the addiction science and you grew up with everything? If you start struggling with something or have like severe anxiety or anything like that, do you kind of self-analyze and turn it into a problem that you would solve with a patient, or try to keep that separate?
I have good boundaries in my life. I know how to keep things very separate, but that comes with a lot of my own healing work.
Right.
That comes with a lot of work. But I think it's very important, and I think as we continue to talk about grief and healing, that you'll see that those are the fabrics of my life. That's those things are with me forever. That's my journey. That's who I am. And those things still come up in my life to this day. I'm still triggered by my inner child work. No matter what, but we'll talk about that, some of the things as the questions that you had for me. You'll see that that's just who we are. But so I did that work for mental health and addictions, and I feel like that's just the work that I kind of moved into. I do a little bit of different work in the day now. I went back and got a master's degree, and my day work is a little bit different. I also had another business. I know this sounds so weird. I was on Netflix as a professional cake artist as well on the side.
Okay. Was that therapeutic for you? Is that why you got into that?
I have an art background, so I'm very graphic-y, kind of designy, kind of. So I channeled my work into that because my son was very sick. He had Crohn's disease, and I spent many years in the hospital with him. And so I took a kind of hiatus from work and when I went back and got my master's degree. And so I kind of indulged myself in some art, and it was that medium. And I was a US rep for a big magazine and in the cake industry, and I traveled around the world and I competed. And I don't know, it was kind of the mindfulness kind of healing work that I did. So
I can see that.
That's awesome.
I've always been in coaching and healing and teaching. I've always been in that area of work. I've never really left helping others. But in that, saying that, my daughter struggled with an addiction. And she, let me just step back a little bit. So I was divorced. And at that time, I think that's where a lot of my issues started to come up. And, struggles with my stuff and my children. And, being a parent, we don't have a rule book. We make a lot of mistakes.
Right.
I think there were times where she had maybe a lot of anger around things that had happened, because her dad disappeared for a while because he was very upset. And she had her own mental health issues. She was ADD, and she also had scoliosis. And so at 14, they gave her pain medication for her back. And it wasn't, I don't believe, I can't even really remember what it was, but it was something for pain.
Sure.
And then she went to, I'm in Chicago, and we took her downtown, and then they gave her something like through an IV for her back. And at that point, she started to seek out other things for pain at 15, 14, 15.
Wow.
And it was a spiral from that point on. A lot of conflict between her and I, a lot of just, I think some drinking started. We started to have some other issues happening. And then at 16, she went into treatment. First time. We because of my own family history, and she knew recovery, and my brother was even clean at that time. She knew something wasn't right, and that she was having some issues herself, and she was very close to my mother. So she had some period of clean time. But then just, it was on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off. And then she went to live with her dad for a little bit because she knew she could get away with more with her dad than with me. And so through her 20s, her years there, she got with some people that were not healthy,
Sure.
some relationships. And then I think at 22, she met somebody, and then my grandkids were born in that period of time. But through those 3 years, she was clean. She was doing well.
I want to kind of go back just a little bit. Whenever all this started, whenever she actually got on the pain meds, were you concerned, and did the doctors like talk to her at all and be like, hey, these are the risks? Did you talk to her about the risks? Anything like that?
Oh yeah, she had treatment, and she knew, but at 18, she was doing her own thing.
Did she drop out of school? Because it seems like it was chaotic.
Yes, she did.
Okay.
Yes, she did. And so when her brother was ill during that time, he had his colon removed, and there was a lot of attention around him, whether he was going to live. And so she was kind of off doing her thing. Even though we were trying to help her, I was trying to save my son. It was a really tough
Wow.
It was a really tough time for me as a single mom.
I can't even imagine.
I felt like I made so many mistakes. I beat myself up so much. Like,
You're okay. It's easy
I
to
think,
see that stuff in hindsight.
and I think as mothers, we take on the role of everything. And it's like,
oh God,
you can't be
right.
superwoman, like, but you
I,
are superwoman.
I had to process so much like guilt and shame around that period of my life. Here I had a nurse and a doctor in my home. My son was fed on a PICC line. And then I had a child who was out like struggling with her own life. And I was really, it was like 3 years of my life at that time.
You were living in fight or flight mode probably the whole time.
Yes, there's a grief of ambiguous grief that people live with. And so ambiguous grief is when someone is living that is like someone maybe go off to war and you are grieving that person, or someone who has Alzheimer's, they're present but they're not mentally or physically present. So you're dealing with someone who has an addiction, who is living, but they're not mentally or physically present. So I was grieving my child who was sick. My son was sick, and I'm grieving my daughter who is physical living, but she's mentally or physically not present. So I'm grieving two children at the same time in my life, and I feel like I'm dying. So that time of my life, it was really, really difficult for me. And so that's one type of grief that a lot of people deal with in silence.
Yeah.
And a lot of parents who are dealing with children or loved ones who are have active addiction is dealing with ambiguous grief in their life. It's very much a struggle for them, and they carry a lot of guilt and shame around that type of grief. So as my son started to get his life together, my daughter became very much out of control. She turned to, for that 3 years of her life, with a person that she was with, some really hard drugs. And my life shifted to try to save her life. And it spiraled. And she fell into the hard stuff, and there's this thing that goes around of a lot of times when you're dealing with someone in addiction is set these boundaries and tough love and shut the door on them, and there is no right or wrong way to deal with someone who's has addiction. And for me, I was the one who opened the door, and the meal, the bath, and the sleeping, and I looked at it as that was my 24 hours to try to save her. That was my time to sit down with her and say, listen, this is your time to try to get to treatment. This is your time to, maybe we could, get you to detox. She stole everything I had at that time. She even stole my car. And I, one time, and I, had to make a police report. She stole the van from the halfway house, and they pressed charges, and we put her in jail. But when she was in jail for that time, she was clean, and we had a chance to speak to her and tell her everything that we needed to tell her, and love her. And she was sick. She wasn't a bad person.
Right.
She was struggling with an addiction. And So, we did everything that we could for her.
Growing up with
But
that addiction background, I mean, I'm sure you know at least a little bit. There's only so much you can do when you're trying to get someone to stop using. They have to,
yes,
at some point, feel like they are ready. Did that demoralize you in any way? Because I guess you kind of know no matter how hard you try, it might not make a difference.
yes, of course, of course. There were times where she did make it for a period of time. We had some clean time for 6 months. She got a job. She was a certified nurse. She was or assistant,
Wow.
a certified CNA.
CNA?
Yeah.
CNA. She did have time where she get herself clean and go to school. She had moments of success in her life. She didn't want to be there. Oh goodness, we have letters that she wrote where she was trying her best to get out of that. You
You
know,
know, it's such a hard thing because you just feel like you can't put you don't know how to put one foot in front of the other. And like even stealing the van at the halfway house. When I was in the halfway house, we used to have thoughts of like, let's get out of here. It's like that addict mentality of like, oh my God, I need that fix. It's a very powerful
Mhm.
feeling.
Yes, and that's where all of my story is with her.
Right.
Now the she came out of jail, and 8 days later she died of fentanyl poisoning because she got something, but it wasn't what she expected to get. It was 43 NGs of fentanyl, which is probably enough to take out a freaking 10 people.
Yeah.
But it wasn't what someone gave her. The person who has been a bad influence on her through the last 2 years of her life um, she was very codependent in her addiction, and it happened. Uh, we in grief we we felt it coming for some time. So I want to go into grief because even though we had a lot of anticipatory grief, now anticipatory grief comes with people who anticipate grief happening. This could be
Right.
somebody who's going to die with cancer,
Yeah.
someone who, even for me, who was and knew that waiting for that call, right? Her father and I knew with the way that things were happening in her life that it could happen, right? We knew it. But
Right.
when it happens, your body, your brain goes into this way, goes into our amygdala of our brain. It goes into hijack where it protects our body. And in disbelief, and the trauma around losing someone we love is we don't believe it. And
Right.
so it doesn't matter if we have anticipatory grief when we're losing someone with cancer, or we're losing somebody that we love, or a child, or anything. In grief, our body is protected. And I've heard this before, it's like a brain injury. Our brain is affected in grief no matter what. And we have this disbelief, but it's a normal part of our human life. It's just normal for us. But we also struggle because a lot of times we don't know how to do it, and we think we're doing it wrong.
Well, and
We
it's
think,
different. It's different whenever it's a child too, because like whenever it's grandma and
yes,
grandpa, you kind of it's going to happen eventually. But the child is an abnormal thing. That's not supposed to happen.
correct,
So
Right.
correct, correct.
that's a whole
Yes,
different ball game.
yes, absolutely. And I think the misconception here is grief is not just about loss of a death either.
I believe it's like a whole healing process that you have to go through. Like, what do you said that you don't believe in the stages of grief, correct?
Correct.
Can you
I
elaborate
don't.
on that?
I don't believe in stages of grief, and I do respect the professionals in the industry. I've been part of some of the other professionals that do have the stages of grief. Um, uh, I've even worked with them
Sure.
in the stages of grief. I've been part of some of their training and their classes. I believe there's no end to grief because it's not really a problem.
Right.
It's not a problem to be solved, really. It's a part of our human experience that shapes us, right? It's something that's ongoing. It's a process of integrating the loss into our life. So if we lose someone we love, it's love. It's we live with grief. We build our life around grief. It changes us. It's and grief is very personal. It's individual. It's something we don't get over. It's rather something we live with. We evolve. So when I lost my daughter, a part of me is lost too. And I need to rebuild my life. So there's really no end in grief.
So when people say time heals all wounds, I don't believe that. Like,
here's the thing. When we, even as like a counselor or a grief coach, as a life coach, whatever, when we are triggered in something in our life, whether that's a loss of a job, a loss of a pet, a loss of a child, a loss of someone we love, our life changes. Our life changes.
right.
And we are a different person now. All of the stuff from our past, if it isn't been dealt with, it comes flying forward to be healed, right?
You're right.
It comes up. So, for me, a lot of grief came up from things in my life, like, I missed my grandfather. Things come up when I lost my daughter. Other things come up. And so we evolve differently. I'm a different person than I was before. And then we carry that forward with us. I'm different than I was before. I have to rebuild my life.
Like the world looks different. Like when you look at the sun, it feels different. When you look up in the sky, you know something changed.
Yes. Prior to her passing, I did presentations on grief. I worked with clients with grief, but now I'm in the trenches with people who have lost someone, a child, and I feel different. I can feel them differently.
Have you always been an empath?
Yes.
Like always?
Yes.
I
My
could
whole
tell.
life. My whole life. But it's almost like an addict who's recovering. My mom can really feel that because she's been there.
Right.
It's one of the things I teach in my classes is that find your tribe, because it's so important to be around others who understand your grief. No one will ever understand your pain, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Right.
Your
Yeah.
grief is your own. You will never understand my pain because that is a personal journey that you will walk. My pain is between me and my daughter. And that is sacred. It is sacred and it is personal. That's why people say grief is lonely. It's a lonely journey of healing. We come into this world in diapers and we leave in diapers. And in between, you're walking in your diapers because it is personal. No one can heal your pain. It is internal and it is your own stuff. It's your own work to do. And so that's why it's so important to understand. You must be around people who understand your pain. I could stand in a room with 1,000 people who lost children. We all can have a commonality, but no one will ever understand my pain at
Right.
all.
Did you, whenever you first started moving into more of the grief side with people who lost children, did you try and like relate your situation to theirs and it brought you to this point? Or did you understand that from the start, just you knew you would never relate the same way because it is your own story?
No, I knew that before because I still, even in my classes now, I don't have just people who have lost children. I have all people who just are dealing with grief, because grief is common. We're all on a journey at a different place. And I think it's so important that you meet people where they're at.
Hmm.
You meet, everyone is at a different place, and it's important to respect where people are at. I'm still on my grief journey, and I will be forever a teacher. I will also be a student in my
Sure.
life. And so I think, I can only take people as far as I am. And so I'm always growing and always learning and always healing. And
Right.
so that's part of something that's so important, is to make sure that, we're all on a journey. We're all on a journey of healing and growing. And I think just that's important. It just never really ends. We're just always at the next lesson of learning. Now, when I get to the other side, I'm going to ask, like, I'm not coming back because I don't want to learn anymore. I don't want to, I don't want to, this, I don't want to know more journeys. I don't want no more
Right.
lessons. I'm done with, I think as soon as I got one done, I get something else, but
Whenever you open up a session, if you have a client or whatever, how do you approach that? They tell you their story and what happened and what are the first steps. I'm sure it changes a lot depending on the person, but is there a kind of structure to it, or does it completely just off the wall? It's whatever is going on.
I think it's important to first start where the person's at,
Sure.
in their life. And one of the things we do is I get a yardstick. We get a yardstick and we determine where you are in your yardstick, because there are different places. People are at different places in their life.
Sure.
And you want to start where you're at. We have a pendulum we swing in life, right? We are in our journey. And sometimes I say, well, where are you at in your day? Where are you at in your day? Because sometimes in the day I can be in the past, and that oftentimes that's where our depression lies.
Yep.
And sometimes
Yeah.
I can sit in that depression for a few days. I can think about what it was like to walk into the hospital and see my daughter laying there on the gurney. I'm traumatized from that. I'm traumatized from opening that curtain and seeing the ambulance that took her out. I'm traumatized from that. That's difficult for me. And when I come up behind an ambulance, it triggers me back to that. And it's painful for me. And then sometimes I look and that yardstick will take me to the future, like thinking her children, having to take my granddaughter to her dance. It brings me to that future that my daughter's not there to see her dance on the stage. And our brain, our thought process can take us there, right?
Right.
And so I look at the yardstick and how do I get back to the middle, to the balance of that? And we
I love
swing
that.
pendulum. We swing that pendulum in the day, back and forth and back and forth. Sometimes I'll stay in that past back there and I'll stay in bed for 24 hours and eat junky food and watch trashy TV. And that's okay. But we
Right.
don't want to stay there too long, because why? Complicated grief can occur. And that is a true true thing that can happen in our grief. It's a diagnosis of complicated grief. So we want to make sure we watch where we're at on the yardstick. I use that with my clients. Where are you at on your yardstick? And when we are in the present, so I use the P, the point of power is in the present. The point of power is in the present. And when we are balanced in the present, even in grief, I cry in the point of power, but when we are in the balance of present is when we move forward. It's in our gratitude. It's in our place of balance. And that's when we are in the present. And so how do we get there?
Did you lean on faith throughout this, or
I am not a
the opposite
religious
way?
person.
Okay.
I'm not a religious person. I'm a very spiritual person. I
Spiritual.
do believe in God. I do believe I do believe in that. I'm not a religious-y person, but I'm a very spiritual-based person.
I understand.
But we can talk about how to get there, how we get to that place, because we can get stuck in those other places. So it's very important. We also talk about a hula hoop. It's important to set boundaries. Self-care is so important. Boundaries are really difficult, especially for those who are recovering, and I understand that because we weren't taught boundaries growing up.
Right.
Boundaries are the hardest thing for my clients. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. Saying no, setting boundaries is one of the most difficult things in self-care.
We want to talk about our sponsor for the day. That is Betty. Betty is a life coach. She does a absolutely amazing job. She specializes in family coaching, addiction coaching. She helped me with my anxiety. She's helping Marie with all types of stuff, just in general. She has been awesome enough to be our sponsor. And what we are doing in partnership with her, if you text her PodTox, you will get your very first session for free.
So I did in my first session with her. I've been in therapy for 9 years. And in my first session with her, I got so much value out of it that I was shocked. Like, I called Kyle and was like, I could not believe, because she made me think differently than my therapist. Sometimes it's good to have a fresh set of eyes, because you never know what that person sees in you that the other people might not have picked up on.
And it can be for anything. Like I said, she does stuff with jobs if you want to get farther in your career. She does a lot with addiction. She also works at a rehab center, so it's kind of her wheelhouse. But yeah, Betty is absolutely amazing, and she'll get you figured out if you just text her that and let her know your name. She'll work with you to get your first one scheduled, and then you can kind of go from there.
So one of the questions you asked me was, what are the things people struggle with the most in grief? So one of the most common things is that people is that closure, believing those stages are like the acceptance frame, like, oh, I should accept this and then move on. There's a misconception to that, because one of the things that a lot of my clients struggle with is the social pressure on the outside from others. And we're talking about the boundaries, because people say, have family members like, oh, it's time to get over this. You need to move on. We need to remember that this is your grief. You are dealing with it in your way. My clients struggle with this because people do that because they are having difficulty with your grief, with the emotion. They're having difficulty with your feelings, so they want you to shut down. It's triggering their feelings. It's triggering their stuff.
Right.
So where is that line? And again, I guess this is every situation, but where's that line between someone stepping in and being like, okay, you need to snap out of this because it's taking too long, or that complicated grief stage where you're just stuck in bed constantly and it never ends? Is there I'm guessing that line's kind of blurry. How do you pull somebody out of that's stuck in it too long, I guess?
I feel like you have to kind of give people grace. and let them go through the
Yes.
emotions and feel the pain. Like people, you have to feel those feelings in order to heal.
Well, and the reason I ask this is because a lot of people who are struggling with addiction and withdrawal and everything, different type of grieving process, because a lot of those people think I'm never going to get better, woe is me, and it's going to be horrible. So they end up making it worse by laying in bed constantly because you need to start moving and activating those chemicals in your brain. So it's if you don't get that kick in the butt, you kind of get stuck, but at the same time, it's almost like necessary.
Yeah, I think that there is maybe a fine line where, there has to be some support system, but I also feel like when you're dealing with a loss, you have to give people some grace, some time,
Right.
and because there is uh, and you have to know that person, but I'm speaking from a place of when you have someone who is really putting the pressure on for you to shut down, shut that shit down, because they're struggling with your feelings or emotions, or they don't want to hear it anymore. If you're talking about a loss or you're talking about your feelings and they don't want to hear it anymore, this is where we have a problem.
Right.
Sometimes in grief, you have to let go of things that no longer serve you. And I've lost some relationships in my grief because, people struggle with your grief. Some people don't want to, even in recovery, you're going to have to take care of yourself. It's very important. And grief is complicated, I think, sometimes. You're going to trigger other people's emotions and feelings if you are dealing with your stuff.
So have you, I know I've seen this like before happen to people where, and it's happened to me where you're not currently like involved with that person and they pass or you didn't have a good relationship, but then all of a sudden you're idolizing that person and like in your, you grieve that person, but it's almost like you put them on a pedestal when you had issues with them in life. Have you ever seen, like, do you know what I'm saying?
That grief makes you realize what they actually did for you that you didn't appreciate when they were alive.
That's
Yeah,
what I'm
guilt and
saying.
shame. And that could be the way that they're processing that, maybe. My mom lost her mother, and it took her 20 years to process her guilt and shame around that.
How do you tell people to deal with guilt and shame? Because I know that I even struggle with that.
Hmm.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's a journey. It's a process that you have to deal with yourself. Um, you know, I think that there are different ways that you do it in counseling or therapy. For me, I've had to write a lot of letters and burn them. I've had to do a lot of screaming. But one of if we don't deal with it, it's going to come out in relationships. It's going to come out in other ways in our life until we deal with it. A lot of times, I have a lot of clients that, get out of relationships and then they get back in another one and they think this is it. And it's a repeated relationship of the same thing. And it's coming
Right.
up again. It's going to come up again until it gets resolved.
Yep.
And because you're just going to keep repeating the same scenario until it's healed. And I think that, it's okay. It's nothing bad. It's not wrong, but we're here to learn lessons in life. We're here to help others, and we're here to help each other. And so we're not perfect. We need to understand that. And we're right where we need to be. And stop being so damn hard on ourselves for the mistakes we make. We beat ourselves up till no end when we don't do things correctly. And so I think it's just so important to be kind to ourselves and to love ourselves through our difficulties. We're not going to have all the answers. Things will come up at the time that they're supposed to. Sometimes it'll feel overwhelming. Sometimes we'll feel like we're going through a dark cave. But that cave, that darkness, is where our light shines for enlightenment. And, it's so important to just be okay in the place we're at.
I had a lot of issues with that whole guilt thing, because back in the day I had one of my best buddies. He got sober and everything seemed like he was all good, and he ended up unaliving himself, but he called me like 2 days before and was like, hey, you want to hang out? And called another one of our friends and said the same thing. And we were both busy. Like, I've got kids, I work a lot, I have a lot going on. So I said, hey, I'll see you on the weekend. We'll figure something out. And like right whenever the weekend started, he shot himself. So I had a ton of guilt because I was like, I should have been there because maybe that would have saved him. And it took a long time to figure that out. And I still don't think I have it figured out.
And you might not ever have it figured out.
No, you
You
won't.
have to continuously put one foot in front of the other and really try to just keep doing what you're doing.
I guess I try and analyze my friends a lot more because I always worry if I'm not doing enough, but I am, again, a very, very busy person, so it's hard sometimes. So I feel like I probably put myself in kind of a depressed state in that present because maybe I can't go hang out with somebody that I haven't seen for a while and I'm worried about them all of a sudden, and I probably don't need to be.
So let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure.
So it's so important that, I could carry a lot of guilt and shame. We all could carry a lot of guilt and shame.
Right.
And so, we have to remember that we are the only person we have control over. We cannot control anything that happens to anyone, not our children, not anyone outside of ourselves. And I think that's one of the most important things that we have to remember in this lifetime is that, and what guilt and shame does to not only our body, our brain, it has so many effects on us because, guilt is dangerous to our physical body. It could cause cancer, heart disease. I mean, it just does so many things to us. And we need to be more self-compassionate to ourselves. It's so important. Learning to forgive ourselves is so critical.
And I saw your video about self-care, how important it is when you're grieving to try to do self-care things for yourself.
What do you suggest for stuff like that for self-care? It's going to depend on the person, but are there things that really, really work? I know music therapy and stuff like that can be big.
So when you're grieving, one of the biggest things is doing things that are mindful. So what are those kind of things? So when we are, especially if you deal with anxiety or any types of struggling with sleep, doing things that are mindfulness are so important. What are those types of things? If you could guess,
I would say taking a walk in nature, connecting with nature,
moving your brain, that we're doing things that you love or things that move your brain away from that thought. So coloring, cooking, gardening, mechanical work, painting, things that where your thoughts are not on your thought process. Like for me, I love like graphic design work. I love coloring. I love painting. I love, artsy stuff. Doing things that are mindfulness at night before you sleep is so important when you're in grief, because it helps it lowers your blood pressure, it lowers your heart rate, it helps you to relax, and it's so important. Meditation, sometimes journaling, all those things that have really good ways to relax the brain. It moves you from one part of the brain to the other part of the brain. It's so important.
And
And acknowledging those feelings. Good Lord, if you listen, I do readings with people too, and I have clients that come to me like 10 years down the road, and they'll be like, I want to talk to my loved one, and 10 years you've been holding on to feelings around loss. Good Lord, you've had cancer, you've had heart disease, you've had this, and this. 10 years you haven't processed grief from a loss? That's scary. That's really scary to me. You've lost 10 years of your life. 10 years of your life. It's so important to deal and feel and heal. So one of my very, very favorite sayings is when you're struggling with, let's say you have a thought, right? You have a thought in your brain where I'm not good enough. I'm not feeling worthy. I'm angry. You get this thought and you start that spiral, right? That spiraling thought that you're like, oh my God, I'm going there. And you feel it in your heart, right? And I write this down because it's my very favorite thing. It saved me so many times. It's a quote by Wayne Dyer. Change the way you look at things, and the things you look at change.
That's something I used to do a lot with the kids in my family, especially when I was using. I was never good enough because I was letting everybody down all the time. So yeah, I don't actually know how I got out of that, because I went through a long stretch where that was an issue, and I don't remember what I did, but apparently it worked because I'm good now.
Doing things that upset someone else, or if you say no, and if someone gets upset, that's not about you.
Right.
That's I've had to say no to my son to watch his kids, and that's okay. I needed to take care of myself. So, learning to say no and take care of yourself is okay too. Other people's responses are none of your business.
I feel like that's the first step in setting boundaries, is learning to do what's best for you. You have to make that conscious choice to say, I choose myself.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other kind of like types of grief? Because we've talked a lot about death and everything like that.
Yep.
What are some of the other big things that people grieve about?
So let's talk about secondary grief. Secondary grief are things that happen that are second to the loss. So let's say we remove alcohol from someone's life, or drugs. Secondary grief is all the things that come secondary, such as like maybe loss of friends that you had in your life that you lose, that you thought were friends, which maybe some were really good friends that you need to step away from, or loss of maybe place you lived, or things that are secondary. You need to grieve those. You need to grieve all that stuff. And it's very difficult because you're in an in-between stage, right? You're in this in-between, and it's yucky in there. It feels nasty to stand right in there. You're standing in this in-between place, and it's very uncomfortable. This is why people go back to the comfortability. This is why they relapse. They're called back to what they know a lot of times, instead of moving forward to the unknown. And it's the same in a lot of times in grief. When we're in grief, sitting in this yucky feeling is difficult. So what happens?
Right.
People medicate themselves. They'll medicate, they'll get something to make them feel better. They'll drink. A lot of times people in grief will medicate themselves with alcohol. I don't drink. So, people will go get something to make the pain go away. They'll go shopping. People don't like pain. So they medicate themselves in grief instead of dealing with the pain. So then in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, what happens? It all comes up because something else happens in their life.
It's like a volcano.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or they are taking it out on somebody else. It's this person's fault. It's this person's fault. It's this person's fault, instead of dealing with the pain inside. So the grief is going to come up backwards, or it's going to come out. We have a collective grief. Collective grief is what we all feel together. It's the worldly grief. So like in 9/11, or when we're, something happens collectively, like maybe a plane crashes or something. We all feel that grief. It's the universal grief. It's the energy we feel. It's our intuition. It's what we're feeling internally. We all have an intuition. We all have that innate kind of feeling where we walk into a room and we feel the energy, right? So we're feeling that collective grief. And that's when a disaster happens or some type of collective. We're feeling the pain worldwide.
Like prices of everything have gone up recently.
Yes.
So
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. We're feeling the collectiveness of grief, like, COVID or whatever. We've all feel it.
Right. That's a good one.
Cumulative grief is when someone has grief close together. So maybe one person passes, and then like the mother passes, and then a few months later the father passes, and then maybe they lose a house, or cumulative grief is when something happens one after the other and they don't have time to grieve one thing. So
Right.
It happens very quickly, and that's a lot to hold for one person. Losses happen, multiple losses in a short period of time. And then disenfranchised grief is when it's not accepted by society. Disenfranchised grief doesn't fit in. It's taboo kind of grief. It may be like, let's say that someone passes, like maybe someone's married to somebody, and then they get divorced, but then that person passes. But if my ex-husband's mother passes, I'm still going to grieve that lady. She was part of my life at one point. But if my family says, "Why are you grieving that woman? You haven't seen her in like 10 years or whatever." Still, she was part of my family. So there,
Right.
that, or maybe if there's something about like a different culture, kind of has some different cultures. It's just not accepted by society. There's some expectations around that type of grief. So those are there are maybe a few others, but those are pretty much the norm, like the ones we teach or talk about.
Besides, death and that type of grief, what is like the worst thing that usually gets people, that people struggle with?
Is this going to be over? Is this because I think we've all heard like, I got to do these stages. Am I going to get to acceptance? And am I going to be done with this? And not knowing that, that this is just a part of who you are, and learning to embrace grief.
Because it alters your life. Grief alters your life.
Correct.
It completely changes the dynamic of things.
Correct. Because part of you kind of dies with grief.
Right.
And then you have to move through pain. We don't like pain in society. We want to numb pain. We don't want to deal with feelings. And many of us have been grown up not knowing how to deal with life, or have had come from trauma.
Emotions. Yeah, like how to process your emotions.
Correct. And a lot of us, our belief systems were stem from our childhood. So if we had, a childhood where shame and guilt was our message, how are we supposed to move through emotion, express ourselves as adults?
Sure.
We don't know what grief is. We don't know that. So, this that it is difficult. We want to move through it and be done with it.
Right.
And so a lot of times people want the pain to go away.
And a lot of times I feel like people feel like I'm 40 years old and I'm going to live the next 40 years without this person in my life. Like it's hard to imagine moving forward without that person.
Right. So what does your class usually look like whenever you have your classes? What is the process going on there?
It's 4 weeks long, and we talk about we do touch on the brain 1 week, which I think I think most of my clients or my students think like this is the greatest part of the whole 4 weeks because they're fascinated with what happens to our brain in grief. And then, of course, we touch on the different types of grief. And then 1 week we do a personalized self-care plan. I think that is critical. And they make sure they know that 4 weeks isn't going to make your pain go away, but they receive some tools for their toolbox. And we talk about getting the ruler. We talk about getting a hula hoop for their boundaries. So the 4 weeks really is just about learning about themselves, about gaining some tools, about understanding grief. It isn't, going to fix them by no means, but I think it's important to understand that they're not in a going crazy, because we all think, I'm going crazy in grief. And am I doing it wrong? No, you're not doing anything wrong. And just walking away with some things that can help them along their journey, because it is a journey. It's something that we embrace and we're going to walk it, and everyone's going to do it differently.
Did you have any like last minute words of advice or anything that really helped you a lot whenever it came to your daughter or anything like that that you wanted to share?
Just love yourself, be compassionate to yourself, and
Take care of
take care
you.
of you. Take care
Yep.
of you.
Patty, I just wanted to let you know throughout the comments today, I've seen so many people saying that they needed to hear your message.
Mhm.
Seriously. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.